Well, let's move now away and more to the area of diplomacy. While the eyes of the diplomatic world are on the United Nations General Assembly in New York City, though that's largely a virtual gathering this year, another session of the UN Human Rights Council is underway in Geneva. Now, that council is run, ironically and unfortunately, by some of the world's worst human rights abuses. And by rule, they single out Israel for condemnation each year, even recently publishing a blacklist of international companies doing business in the West Bank. Well, our senior U.S. correspondent Mike Wagenheim spoke today with Israel's new ambassador in Geneva, Korea diplomat Meirav Eilon Shahar, an early opponent of the Human Rights Council. They discussed about whether change is possible in Geneva at that Human Rights Council, given new circumstances in the Middle East.
Madam Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us, taking up your new posting in Geneva just a few short weeks ago. What are your top priorities here as you settle in?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be on your show. What are my priorities? There are many. First, I'd like to advance Israel's interest in the United Nations. I know it sounds, of course, obvious. Here in Geneva, we have many organizations. Folks like to focus on the Human Rights Council, but there are many others, whether it's the WHO or WIPO, dealing with intellectual property, or ITU dealing with telecommunication. There are numerous organizations, in fact, actually more than 40 international organizations that sometimes affects our life, the everyday life of an Israeli. It's regulatory bodies, and of course, there are norm-setting bodies. So we do have a lot of work cut out for us here in Geneva. I'd like to see Israel more prominent in many of these bodies. Having said that, I cannot ignore the Human Rights Council, of course. Nobody can. Yesterday, I spoke about human rights in Syria, the grave violations that are done by the Assad regime. And of course, its supporters, Iran in Syria, Hezbollah as well. There's a special inquiry done by the Human Rights Council into what goes in Syria, and we have voiced also our concern. So raising concerns about issues that are important for my country, and certainly also defending Israel in issues where the Council decides to take matters where it should not.
There has been an inordinate and many would say anti-Semitic focus on Israel, especially within the Human Rights Council, but within other bodies there in Geneva. As Israel opens up its ties and normalizes ties with more countries in the Arab world, more countries in the African world, do you see the curve coming in Geneva in terms of its treatment of Israel, especially in domains such as the Human Rights Council?
Mike, I'm glad you brought it up. Actually, this is my job here, to make sure that the reality is reflected in the United Nations institutions. It's not always the case, just the contrary. Usually it's not the case. I can tell you that in this session of the Human Rights Council, no one spoke about the peace agreements that Israel has signed with the United Arab Emirates and with Bahrain. I was the only one who did so. So I was the only one, not the High Commissioner herself, nor any other countries. My job is to make sure that the reality on the ground is actually reflected here. And what a reality it is. I have no doubt that these peace agreements, these historic peace agreements, will change the dynamics in my area, in the Middle East area. We are positive that more will follow. And that's exactly what I want to do here. I want to make sure, even if no one else will speak about it but me, that the reality is reflected by me and by my team here, the entire mission, not only at the Human Rights Council, but in other bodies as well.
I want to refer back to the Human Rights Council for a moment. Still out there lingering is this blacklist of international companies that are doing business in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. This list was put together by the Human Rights Council. There is no other list like it, identifying companies doing businesses in disputed territories around the world, only in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank. Israel is fighting this list vehemently The list is to be updated every year. Do you see this blacklist, A, having an actual impact on business being done, and B, what is Israel's strategy for trying to contain any potential damage?
As regard to the Human Rights Council, as you know, we are not members of the Human Rights Council. We never were, and we don't have any intention of joining it anytime soon. We would like to see a substantial change in the Human Rights Council, starting with the cancellation and the abolishing of Item 7, which makes it a body that is institutionally biased against my country. And this is something that is unacceptable. And, the world now, especially with the normalization, should put an end to it. I am also disappointed with the High Commissioner and her office for not balancing this institutional bias of the Human Rights Council, of this Agenda Item 7. And certainly when it comes to the database that was published last February, we were very disappointed with her office. We reject this database, and we called and still continue to call on companies not to cooperate with this database.
Question about the foreign ministry. You are a longtime veteran of the ministry, and there's renewed light now with these normalization agreements, with outreach to countries that Israel doesn't currently have official ties with. There is much work to be done by the ministry around the world in engaging now and creating different partnerships and creating different agencies to establish these new bilateral ties. Is the ministry at this point, does it have the resources? Does it have what it needs in order to build up these relationships? It's a lot of work in the days, weeks, and months ahead here.
Well, it's not only ties and connections. We are building new embassies. That's what we're doing. We're opening embassies in the Arab world. That's the wonderful news that we have. And we have a minister, Gabi Ashkenazi, who is leading us, who has been able and enabled us with resources that he brought to do so and to regain strength. And we will continue to do it under his leadership. He is very adamantly not only brought the resources needed for us to work, but has elevated the ministry to its rightful position.
Thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it. Congratulations on the new posting. We wish you well, and we'll check back with you every now and again. And we appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And stay safe.